building a network society is about building relationships between people, and that necessarily has to start at a very small scale, sitting around a dinner table together. Another thing we like to say at Cabin is that until you've coordinated a dinner party and cleaned up the dishes afterwards, you probably shouldn't try to tackle bigger governance questions.
Hey, welcome to Next Meta, a podcast and a newsletter about on-chain economies, coordination, most effective tactics, and the bigger picture. Serious topics and a not-so-serious host. Hope you enjoy. Welcome, Jonathan, to the Next Meta podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, happy to have you. So John is the founder of Cabin, a network city. And what I like about Cabin, as opposed to all of the other like network state like projects, is that it's a lot more about building connections with like local communities and being more on the ground. So I'll let John speak more to that. But let's start with going deeper on what even is Cabin for people who haven't heard of it.
Yeah, so Cabin is building a network city of modern villages. So these are intergenerational neighborhoods, places where we know our neighbors, raise kids together. They tend to be located, cabin neighborhoods, in walkable pockets of family-friendly urbanism near parks and nature. And the goal is really to create the neighborhoods where we want to grow up, and then stitch these neighborhoods together into a global network city.
All right, that sounds awesome. And how did you get here? What what led you here?
Yeah. So Cabin's been around for a couple years. Originally started in 2021. There was a group called the Creator Co-op. There's a bunch of independent online creators trying to figure out what it meant to work online and build together online in the kind of immediate post-pandemic era. I ended up moving out to the Texas Hill Country and building a cabin in the woods out there and inviting that group out. We originally started Cabin as a DAO to create a residency program for online creators to come out and spend time, with the goal of ultimately trying to build a network city of locations around the world. Since then, both our online community and our network of IRL neighborhoods around the world has grown. And we've been through a couple iterations over the past few years. But ultimately, our vision has always stayed the same: to build this network of neighborhoods. And now we have community that gathers all over the world and lives together and practices our obvious truths, which are kind of the guiding principles of Cabin. And they are: live near friends, it takes a village, and touch grass. And so these are principles that we organize around and bring together a community around as we build local pockets of resilient collective action and grow new neighborhoods to join the network city around the world.
I love it. And what inspired you to start Cabin, or like give us more about your background. Like you don't have to go super deep into it, but yeah.
Yeah, so I was working in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. I was a product director at Instacart, and then after the pandemic, decided to leave and became very interested in um, what we think of at Cabin as new old ways of living. How to bring people together in ways that humans have actually thrived in for thousands of years, but have become increasingly uncommon in our modern times. And originally actually moved out to the hill country of Texas to build this cabin in the woods. And work remotely, write some science fiction. But as I started to do that, it became clear to me that during the pandemic, people were sort of asking, what's the next San Francisco? Is it going to be Austin? Is it going to be Miami? Is it still going to be San Francisco? And the conclusion that I came to as I was building this cabin out in the woods was that the future of cities might not be like the passive cities, and that we might be able to create new types of cities that are internet native. And that was particularly interesting to me because when you think of cities, you think of these single places, but really cities are about people, and networks of people, and density of creative ideas, and that in the internet era doesn't all have to be in one place. And so it became clear that there was an opportunity both to bring together people out at the cabin that I was building in the hill country, but also as people started to come out, that there was this opportunity to grow a network of places like this around the world, and to start to put out a bat signal that could attract interesting people from around the world into this network of physical locations. And that was started in 2021. Then about a year later, Balaji Srinivasan published his book, The Network State, which had a lot of similar ideas in it. I think really opened up a lot more people's minds about the possibility of these type of network societies. Cabin has always thought of itself as a network city and not a network state. That's a distinction we can get into if you're interested. But ultimately, I think the underlying premise is that network societies of all kinds are essentially internet native groups of people trying to build a better version of the institutions of civilization. And that's something that people at Cabin have always been excited about.
All right. Yeah, I didn't want to ask you like about the difference between the network city and the network state.
Yeah, so there's a couple core differences in how we think about it. A network state is ultimately about territorial sovereignty. It's about some sort of diplomatic recognition from existing states, and that has never been the most interesting part of network societies to us at Cabin. We've always been more interested in building interdependent networks that are deeply rooted in specific places. And so if you think about a blockchain analogy, network states are sort of like L1s. They have, territorial sovereignty in the form of essentially like security guarantees. And what we're more interested in building are essentially the L2s, the communities that can exist on top of existing state structures. And there's some other more specific differences in terms of the specific definition that Balaji has in his book. He talks about the importance of one commandment. I've already mentioned our obvious truths, which we think of as several suggestions, which are emergent from the community. We think it's really important to design these systems from the bottom up and have them emerge organically over time, instead of having big top-down systems that are designed as like abstract models. We also believe in polycentric governance, as opposed to the network state's emphasis on a single recognized founder. There's some other more specific details and differences, but ultimately, I think it comes down to, what is your end goal? Are you trying to build systems of networked economy, culture, governance, which is essentially what cities are? Or are you trying to build new forms of territorial independence and a monopoly on violence, or other form of diplomatic recognition from existing states?
Right. Yeah, the former sounds a lot more interesting to me, and I feel like a lot of these network state experiments are about, yeah, like as you described it, and then it kind of leads to building these tax havens and these like ultra luxury places for the wealthy people who are into these memes to come and yeah, not pay taxes, or yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's that's just how I see it.
I think that's like both kind of a fair take, but also maybe a bit of an oversimplification. I mean, to be clear, I'm not like I think there is a role in the world for state-like structures, and in particular special economic zones that are trying to create new forms of basically uh, different regulatory environments. Like Prospera, I think, is an interesting example of a ZA in Honduras, which is essentially a type of special economic zone that has the ability to control more of the regulatory structures, and allow for types of startups that are particularly interested in things that have a lot of red tape in the United States, like health tech, longevity, crypto, drones. I think having zones around the world where these types of technologies can be explored and practiced and developed without the level of regulatory burden that exists in most normal countries is probably a really good thing. So I'm not like totally opposed to that approach either.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the most compelling parts about the whole thing for me personally. Like these, yeah, having places where we can actually freely experiment and try all of these things that we've been talking about on the internet, basically. Uh, I wanted to ask you about, yeah, like how the idea of cabin changed. Like you said, you kind of had this pretty much the same idea since the beginning, but the way it seemed for me is like the way how I initially saw it. I thought, okay, there's these cabins on this very isolated property, first one owned by you, and yeah, it just felt like it's out there somewhere. And then later on, you started posting more about building these local communities and hosting dinners and whatnot. So then it stopped seeming so isolated and so like I stopped seeing it as these like places where you bring people from like creators from around the world to come and hang out, to like being more rooted in this specific location. Is this like the place where you live separate from this place where you built the cabin, or yeah, how did uh, how did that sort of thing
Yeah,
evolve?
that's a great question. Yeah, so cabins, like you said, the vision of cabin has been consistent over time in that we've always been trying to build a network city, but how we have defined that, and the kind of core community that we've built has evolved over time. Um, and we've been around for almost 5 years now, from when we first started with the Creator Co-op. And I think this is one of the really interesting things about DAOs is that they have the ability to evolve and change over time as the community grows and changes. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, we were really a group of online creators, and we were building for creators, particularly with the Creator Co-op, something called the Creator Fellowship, and then the Creator Residency program that spawned the DAO. Starting in late 2021, we were very focused on building for other DAOs because there was this rapidly growing market during the 2021 bull market of DAOs that suddenly had funding. And so we started hosting DAO residency programs, retreats, building DAO tools, media content. And then that market kind of imploded in 2022 with Terra Luna and then FTX, and suddenly there weren't a lot of other DAOs around interested in in-person gatherings. And so we did some soul searching, and we realized that a lot of the DAO operators that were participating in these programs were nomads, and that was still in the post-pandemic period where there was a lot of digital nomad activity around the world, people who were working remotely and traveling. And so we started growing the locations in the network to be basically places for nomads interested in co-living in nature. And we spent most of the past 2 years focused on that, building out our network of rural neighborhoods for long-term co-living, launched our network city, our census, city directory, citizenship, and then ultimately found that what had been tailwinds for nomads interested in living in the middle of nowhere with internet strangers became a headwind as we kind of exited the post-pandemic era. People started settling back down, and we also realized that nomads are, they're inherently nomadic, and so one of the important learnings from that era was that not only is it very challenging, to actually get people to move to the middle of nowhere to live with internet strangers, but also because nomads are constantly moving around to new places, it's harder to build a sense of core, permanent community that can grow into intergenerational neighborhoods. And so, starting, late last year and into this year, we have once again evolved and started focusing more on families because we have seen more members of the community, myself included, become parents over that time. And we've seen the real need for this type of local community, the importance of it when you have kids, because it does take a village to raise kids. And it also takes kids to raise a village. And so, in order to start to build more permanent, rooted local neighborhoods, we realized that both building more for families, though not, of course, only for families, and also in more existing urban and suburban areas, was a better fit for the needs of the community, and that's what we're focused on now.
That makes complete sense, and I think that really feels like an important need in this age of like atomic families and really people getting disconnected and just living in these very small units. So yeah, I think that's awesome. What was I gonna say? Yeah, like how many of these neighborhoods are part of the network now?
Yeah. So we've changed, the type of neighborhood that we're adding to the network, and so in the peak of our, nomads in nature phase, we had about 25 neighborhoods that were built around rural co-living. And as part of this transition, we've actually reduced the number of neighborhoods and focused in on ones that felt like a better fit for where we were heading, as an organization, and as a community. And so I think we're down to about a dozen neighborhoods right now. But we have now started a program called the Neighborhood Accelerator, which is specifically designed to help people create new cabin neighborhoods. And so we are currently operating the first cohort of the Neighborhood Accelerator program, and there will be another one running this fall. And so our plan is, I think we've had a lot of amazing learnings from this first cohort. And we're very excited about and believe in the opportunity of this accelerator program to bring in a bunch of really great neighborhoods. And so we will run this next cohort, and then over the next 3 years, we intend to grow to 100 global neighborhoods.
Okay, that sounds awesome. Yeah, can you tell me more about the program?
Yeah, definitely. So if you're interested in learning more, you can go to cabin.city/accelerator, and learn more about how to turn your neighborhood into a thriving community. Our next cohort, the application deadline is September 8th. And what we do in the program is we basically put you into a cohort with a bunch of other neighborhood builders, some people just starting out and some who have been building neighborhoods for decades, and can help serve as mentors in the program. Um, and we go through a step-by-step process where you will learn how to knock on doors and say hi to people in your neighborhood where you live, start to host recurring events, start to figure out what the needs of your neighborhood are, and how you can perform local collective action with the other people who are around you. And that can look like a lot of different things. Some people have community gardens or park cleanups, or exchange of goods and services. People maybe have things that, if you want to borrow a drill, or you want to use someone's lawnmower, or whatever it is, you can make it easier to facilitate those types of things. But the real core of it is having recurring events and a group chat where people can coordinate locally and start to do things together. And the program helps you not only set up those processes in your local area, but have an accountability and support group of other people who are doing this type of neighborhood building around the world, as well as funding opportunities for local public goods across the network. So we have an incredible group of neighborhood builders who have already gone through this program, mentors who have built local neighborhoods around the world, and a whole curriculum that can help you do this. So you can apply for the accelerator cohort, and learn more about that, like I said, at cabin.city/accelerator. And basically anywhere you live in the world, we can help you turn your area into an active, thriving local community that's a part of this broader network.
I love it. Yeah, there will be a link in the description for anybody interested. I will write about this as well. And you kind of already answered the question, but I would like to go a bit deeper, I guess, or at least hear more about how you personally did it. So yeah, the question is like, then how do you build these thriving communities, or how do you actually do this besides these
Yeah,
ideas that you threw out?
totally. So, the most important thing is just to say hi to your neighbors. It really is that simple to get started. We talk about, when we talk about living near friends at cabin, we mean two things. We mean turning your neighbors into your friends, and turning your friends into your neighbors. And so the turning your neighbors into your friends part starts with just saying hi to people on the street, or knocking on doors, or putting up flyers for an event that you're hosting. Getting people to come out, and just getting to know them a little bit better, and forming connections, which is really easy to do when you have the natural bond of being physically close to each other. And particularly valuable when you also have kids in the mix, or because it just is so easy to bond with other parents, and it's so valuable to have a network of other families around when you have kids. But even if you don't have kids, it's still a wonderful thing to be able to get to know your neighbors, and start to do things with them. Another really great part about starting to build your neighborhood is, once you start hosting recurring events, once you have a neighborhood group chat up and running, once you're sharing local resources or doing things together, then you can start to put out a bat signal, and also then turn your friends into your neighbors, because everybody wants to live in a thriving neighborhood with other great people. And so if you can start to build this type of thing, you can attract other people. And this is another important part of Cabin's network, is you can attract your friends and show them the amazing neighborhood you have, and then also people come to the Cabin network looking for these types of neighborhoods. And so you can build your profile on Cabin City Directory for your neighborhood, show the amazing stuff you're doing in your local area, and start to attract other great humans from across the internet who might be interested in moving into the area where you live.
Beautiful. And one of the things that you started with was hosting dinners, right? And then the kind of, yeah, I guess I assume you started attracting too many people, so you moved on to picnics in the park, which can accommodate a lot more people. Was that sort of how it went?
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, we uh were inspired by a wonderful tweet by Richard Bartlett, which was basically guy who wants to start a network state but has never hosted a dinner party. And at
I
Cabin
saw that one.
we do host dinner parties. It's a good one, and we believe in the importance of that because building a network society is about building relationships between people, and that necessarily has to start at a very small scale, sitting around a dinner table together. Another thing we like to say at Cabin is that until you've coordinated a dinner party and cleaned up the dishes afterwards, you probably shouldn't try to tackle bigger governance questions, because everything has to start small and grow organically this way in order to work. There's something called Gall's law, which is basically that complex systems like a network society have to evolve from simple systems. Um, and if you try to design them from the top down, as these big complex things, they never actually work very well. Um, and so, we've also talked a lot about a kind of framework we think of for evolving network societies, which goes supper, place, village, city, state. And the idea behind that is basically that you have to start with a supper, a dinner, and get together a small group of people, and then maybe you can grow that into something bigger, a place. Maybe it's a gathering in the park, like you said. Maybe it's a rotating cast of a couple dozen people coming by your place regularly. Okay, maybe now you can convince those people to chip in some money to start a third place together, a community clubhouse, or to clean up your local park, or build a community garden, or start a lending library. And from there, you can start to think, okay, now we can grow into a village. Now we can start to think about, larger scale projects that we can take on. But yeah, in order to grow to the larger scale, city, you really have to start with something that looks a lot more like a dinner party.
Right. Yeah, in crypto space, we have this habit of going too far intellectualizing things instead of just going and knocking on the neighbors' doors and like talking to users and
That's
stuff
right.
like that.
Exactly.
I have a friend, yeah, shout out to Umberto. Like he's talking a lot about building these neighborhood DAOs, and
Mm.
yeah, I wanted to ask you like, how does crypto play into all of this? Like, where do you see this the intersection? Like, what are some of the things that you think are useful for from crypto that could be applied to neighborhoods?
Yeah. Um, So I think a lot of what I've been talking about here at the neighborhood scale is about practicing what we call functional local sovereignty. Basically, you don't need to wait for some, big institution or government or something to come and solve all your problems. You can just get together with your neighbors and start to solve your own problems. Um, and that's an incredibly powerful form of sovereignty. Um, and at the extremely local level, you really don't need blockchains for a lot of that. You don't need blockchains to knock on your neighbors' doors, or to let them borrow your drill or whatever. But as you start to scale up, blockchains become a very useful tool for this type of functional sovereignty. Um, and there's a couple versions of that. I think the easiest one to think about is at the network level, because at the very local level, you are mostly dealing with people who you're in a high trust environment where you actually know all the other people involved, and you can have very informal systems. But as you start to network these things together and have larger scale global systems, you need more trustless systems for basically self-governance. And these trustless systems for self-governance are done very well on chain, because they allow you to have a high degree of transparency, and a high degree of capture resistance. And those are really important factors for having bottom-up self-governing systems. So we tend to think of that as the most important use of blockchains within Cabin, is the essentially network governance layer. Um, at the local governance layer, we're real believers and practitioners of duocracy, which is the idea that if you want something to happen, you should just do it. Um, Now
Right.
that said, we also believe that as we're not there yet really, but as crypto tools get better and more usable by normies, we also do think that local neighborhoods can and perhaps should also have some portion of on-chain governance. And what that probably looks like is what we think of as a neighborhood treasury, which is basically taking those same principles that we apply at the network level and thinking about how they apply at the local level. Um, an interesting thing is that it's almost impossible right now to have a bank account that a group of people collectively access and govern. Regular banks don't let you do this. They won't let you have a bank account with 20 people on the bank account because they see
Right.
that as a liability. So even at this small scale, it's actually very useful to be able to use crypto tools, in this case, like a multi-sig, to govern a local treasury of money resources that you want to use for local collective action, because it's not really possible to do that through banks. And even if you could do it through banks, that they don't offer the level of collective access and transparency that you can get from essentially using like a neighborhood micro DAO. Now, like I said, I think there's two big barriers here. One barrier is essentially a user interface barrier, which is that it's very hard to onboard normies into crypto. It's just getting money from normal bank accounts or Venmo or whatever on chain is still a big barrier. Part of that is just due to regulatory blockers like Operation Choke Point 2.0. But part of that's also just due to the complexity that's still associated with the end user product, that wallets and things like this. And then the other part of it is just that crypto has a really bad reputation, of course, with most normies, because they've seen things like FTX and Terra Luna and these like big scams and collapses, which of course did not actually have crypto at the core, ironically, but caused a lot of negative sentiment around it. So I think there's long term definitely an opportunity to create a better local public goods and local financial systems that can be on chain. But I think that part is it's gonna be a long journey to get there.
Right. But you think like most of the opportunities at a higher level rather than like it's like very local communities where you have like 50 people.
Right now, yeah, I think right now, like what DAOs are particularly useful for is cross-border, cross-border transactions in lower trust environments, where you there's really no other option. Like you can't do these things through more traditional banking means. Like I said, I think these things will also be really useful for cases that can't be accomplished at the local level. It's just going to be a longer journey to get there because of the barriers I mentioned.
Right. And what do you think about the community currencies?
Yeah. So I think community currencies are a really interesting idea in theory, but like much of crypto, like you said earlier, the theory gets kind of far ahead of the practice. And so I am very hopeful about the future of community currencies, but I haven't really seen any work particularly well in practice. I think there have been some good experiments. One that I track is Oak, the community currency that was started for Oakland, California, and was being used at like the farmers market and some real use cases like that. And I think the idea of having essentially mutual credit systems that can operate within local communities, or even kind of like almost insurance systems that can operate within local communities. There's a lot of great precedent for that. For instance, the kind of proto network societies that I look to as a good historical example are the what were called like the fraternal orders. So things like the Masons and the Elks and the Rotary Club, these types of organizations operated on, they had mutual credit systems and they had insurance pools that they put together for their members. That was actually the primary financial
Mhm.
product that was, designed around these network societies in a pre-internet era. And so I think there's a lot of potential and opportunity there, but like I said, I haven't really seen great examples in practice. So I'm curious if you have.
Right. Maybe the most like yeah, the places where this is most useful are places like really rural villages in like Africa where they don't have access to good currencies in general. So like one good example, well, it's not really local currency, but more so like a version of DAI, I guess. I can't explain how exactly it works, but are you familiar with grassroots economics?
No, I'm not. I'll look that up.
Yeah, it's a very cool project, and they have like a huge network of villages in Africa that are using it. But basically, they mint this DAI that's backed by DAI, but like yeah, they mint a lot more of it than actually exists to back it. And then people use it to like kickstart their local economies where they have like people who are offering different services or like homemade products or whatever, so really to make it easier to yeah basically to create liquidity in a system where people don't have money but have either uh, labor to offer or yeah products to offer but yeah just don't have anything to facilitate trade. So yeah, I
Cool.
guess that's
Yeah,
a
I
lot more
guess I
useful in
actually have
places
seen
like
this
that
before,
than
but
yeah it's a super cool project I think. But yeah, I can understand why something like that is less useful in like more developed United States where people like these families where you are based, like everybody either has a job or other source of income, and something like a mutual credit would be probably more useful than creating a currency.
yeah, and I think I'm super excited about the types of examples the type of example you shared here. I think that should be a phenomenal use case for essentially local cryptocurrencies. But yeah, to your point, the U.S. dollar is highly liquid and is perfectly useful for most monetary exchanges in places like the United States, but also increasingly a lot of other places in the world. I mean, stable U.S. stable coins, I think, are like $160 billion asset now, and so I think U.S. stable coins will probably continue to grow and be like a primary medium of exchange and settlement in global crypto markets. But where I think I've seen a lot more interesting experiments is basically with definancialized or non-monetary forms of exchange. So at Cabin, we talk a lot about reciprocity economies, and I think that even in a place that has a very liquid, stable currency, having local definancialized reciprocity economies is an important part of building social trust and relationships. And so figuring out how to actually definancialize and have exchanges that are not monetary in nature, but are more like letting people borrow things or sharing resources together, can be a really powerful source of social infrastructure that deepens relationships and deepens local
Mhm.
communities.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. So yeah, the ledger could be useful, but you don't really need tokens or currency, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, having explicit extrinsic motivation or extrinsic currencies can actually devalue the intrinsic motivation of local relationships.
Right, you can mess things up for sure. But I feel like this is also a use case where it gets more useful as you scale. Like if you have a neighborhood or like a community of 50 or 100 people, you really don't need any kind of ledger because people just remember things. And like if you accrue bad reputation, the other people are going to know that like you don't return the favors or whatever. But yeah, that's where the it comes in handy when you want to actually scale across multiple neighborhoods or bigger cities.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
What's do you have any? What's your opinion that other people don't agree with you on? Do you have any of the top of your head something
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big debate that happens in the kind of new cities and network society space that I think a lot of people have traditionally approached and continue to approach the problem of new city building from the perspective of economic development and of because that is traditionally what cities have mostly been is economic agglomeration markets. Um, and so I think there's a lot of folks that continue to want to orient new city building around large scale economic agglomeration. And I think that is a totally valid approach. I'm supportive of projects like California Forever that are trying to take that approach of like um, getting a bunch of land and trying to do these big deals that bring together a county or a state or whatever it is to like do a big economic development project and build a new city from the ground up. But I think we've also seen that approach does not have a very good track record. And most new cities have to grow organically, and so I think something that a lot of new city building folks and I would disagree with is that I think we're playing a different ball game now, and that in the internet era, it's much more important to focus on high density of connections, culture, of building a thing that people want to be a part of, almost essentially more of a movement that can attract really high quality people, and that can become the engine for growth versus trying to just build something that will have like broad appeal in terms of economic agglomeration and job creation.
Right. And this theory also like might not hold as much anymore. Like historically, the bigger city, the more opportunities. I don't know. I forgot like what's the exact quote or exact number, but how like the number of citizens grows. That's like then there's a certain percentage on top of that. How much more wealthy that community is, or like how many more economic opportunities, stuff like that. But now like we're all connected through the internet, and it's like yeah. It's it matters less whether you're physically close or just like connected through the internet.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That seems to be the biggest change. So, yeah, I think a good example of what you're referring to here comes from Jeffrey West's book Scale, where he charted the sort of scaling relationships between various parts of biological systems and also city systems. And it is true that there is a superlinear scaling relationship between essentially population and wages, and also population and like creative employment categories, and that those things are a log relationship, meaning superlinear scaling. So there's a very strong power law relationship between these things in existing
Right.
cities. And so that means that scale really matters. Having massive cities is the traditional way to achieve really creative populations and really high paid populations and all these things. And to your point, I think that is the thing that has changed, is that you no longer need an insanely big scale to get a high density of creative people. In fact, you can do it much more easily at a very small scale, and you can do that because of the internet. So I think that is a sort of fundamental paradigm shift in city building that is at the core of the idea behind network cities.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, not even just that, but like as we've seen throughout the 21st century, like we've seen massive economic growth, but we haven't necessarily seen such a massive increase in people's happiness, or like yeah, we've seen a huge increase in loneliness. So yeah, I think maybe it's time to orient towards solving different kinds of problems besides just economic growth. So definitely agree with you there.
Yeah, that's a core part of the mission of Cabin is that there are these two problems that seem to be driving unhappiness right now, and you're exactly right. One of them is standard of living, and the other one is loneliness or sense of isolation. And I think that if you look at those two problems, you know the isolation one is pretty straightforward. It's basically people living in increasingly atomized lives, suburbs, and staring at their phones all day and not connecting with other humans. And standard of living, there's both been a lot of inflation of existing state currencies as well as increases in the relative cost of the basics of living. So while things like televisions and computers have gotten way cheaper, the core basics that everyone needs, things like food, housing, healthcare, education, are the things that have gotten massively more expensive. And so I think that there is a really elegant solution to both of these problems, which is basically just returning to a new old way of living, to going back to the basics and practicing local functional sovereignty with small groups of people, because the problems of food, housing, education, loneliness. These are things that can actually be solved by you and the other people right around you. You don't need some big grand system to solve them. You can grow food, you
Right.
can build housing, you can make meaning together. I think all of the core problems are sort of directly addressed by building modern villages with people.
Beautiful said. And yeah, I have the question that I ask every guest at the end of the podcast, and you kind of already answered it, but I have to ask it anyway. Maybe you have like a TLDR. So the question is,
Yeah.
what's the meta? And the meta can be like, what's the bigger picture here, or like what's the most effective tactic in this sort of domain? Uh, yeah, whatever you choose.
Sure. Yeah. So, I think that one thing that I look to for inspiration and that I think is underrated in our extremely forward-looking, fast-moving modern world is to find meta in history and in the past, because societies are something that humans have been building for as long as humans have existed, and you can look at the history of decentralized cities and centralized states and see these recurring patterns over time, both throughout Western civilization, looking at the development of technologies and the way it led to cities in the ancient and classical and medieval and modern eras, as well as looking to a lot of non-Western canon examples and the incredible diversity of governance structures and social contracts that humans have had throughout history. The Haudenosaunee, Catalayuk, Uruk, these civilizations that were built around new emerging technologies of the time and people's ability to self-govern in small groups. And so that's my favorite meta, is to look far to the past to find inspiration that we can use to build the future.
And on that topic, do you have any book recommendations?
I do, yes. I think if you want to understand the evolution of the development of cities and how technologies led to decentralized city building throughout Western civilization, there's a book called I believe it's The City in History which is phenomenal. And then for a non-Western canon lens, there's another fantastic book called The Dawn of Everything.
Oh, yeah, I read that one. Write it down for the people in the show notes. All right, and with all of this said, do I sense a cabin DAO rebranding with this change of focus from cabins?
Yeah, we're still we're still called Cabin. We have been through several rebrandings over time, and we continue to grow and change with our community. But we like we've talked about, we've always been building, and we'll continue to build a network city. Yeah, you can find out more about that network city at cabin.city and on socials at spelled out cabin.city.
Awesome. So you can't know that yet. You can't know that yet. Awesome. Well, John, it's been great having you. This has been an awesome conversation. Thank you very much for coming on. And if you have any other links that you want to share, just pass them on to me, and I will make sure to include them in the show notes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me.